Let's introduce our panel from Medcurity, cloud-based HIPAA compliance platform, which supports security risk analysis with remediation recommendations and executive dashboards, as well as policy and BAA management. We have our first member of our panelists, co-founder and CEO of Medcurity, Joe Gellatly. Joe, let me bring you in. There we go. How you doing today, Joe?
Great, Mike. Appreciate the nice introduction.
Yeah, so give us just like the 30-second elevator pitch on Medcurity.
Absolutely. So what we do with exactly what you described, this platform that supports security risk analysis and management for healthcare, is we help these healthcare organizations get clarity on where they are today, where their risks are in today's threat landscape, and then also start to build confidence as they address those risks. And so the platform supports them through the year instead of just this one-time activity snapshot view of an SRA. So as we talk about security and compliance for the rest of this conversation, that's where we kind of bridge that and help our hospitals and our clinics manage that.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Let's bring our second panelist in. With 15 years of experience in data and data analytics, statistics, data science, and technology team management, we have our Senior Director of Data Science and Domain Intelligence here at DNSFilter, Rebecca Gazda. How are you doing today, Rebecca?
Hey, Mike, how are you? Good.
Good. So we're going to hear more about DNSFilter, but I think I'm specifically interested in domain science and domain intelligence. What does that mean at DNSFilter?
Yeah, so I guess mostly what my team works on is data science is half of it. So that's the machine learning and AI engines that kind of live behind the scenes at DNSFilter, and they make everything work. And then the other half of it is domain intelligence, and that's any type of threat research, investigation into threats, looking at new things to try and block with our machine learning and AI, anything like that. So we're basically the backbone to the DNSFilter product.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. And our final panelist with 25 years of experience in the tech industry. He's also worked as a software engineer, incident responder, threat hunter, intelligence analyst, educator. He's investigated hundreds of pieces of malware across many platforms and has written or reviewed just as many malware detection rules. From DNSFilter, our threat researcher, Alex Applegate. How you doing today, Alex?
I'm doing great today, Mike.
So I'm curious, like, and we'll talk about like specific threats, but like if you think over the past like week or two, what's the most interesting threat you've seen?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Wasn't ready for that on this particular
Feel free to expand the scope. What's the first thing that comes to mind? Like something super interesting you've come across recently?
Some of the stuff that I've been seeing lately, there's been a lot more focus on bigger companies lately. There's been people going after Microsoft. There's been some people going after Google. Juniper has been attacked and had to put out a fairly significant patch. I'm curious to see what has come out of some of the most recent Microsoft Windows patches for Windows 11, seeing some of the things going on with that. So there's a lot of emerging research that's coming that's got a lot of potential to do interesting stuff. And Android just released DNS over HTTP 3 for Android for Android 11. So we're looking to see how that goes too.
Very cool. Sorry for putting you on the spot with that question. We've got our whole panel here. I think we're going to start with a poll question. Let me see if I can get this launched here and bring it up. How do we look? Hey, look at that. Things are working as they're supposed to look. So for the attendees, I know we've got some providers, we've got some MSPs. As an attendee on the webinar, what role best describes you? Are you a vendor or an MSP? Are you a provider? Are you an executive? Are you an IT professional? Or are you a compliance officer? So we'll give that poll a chance to load up. Got a couple responses still trickling in. I'll just leave that up for a few more seconds as we look to get started with our actual panel. So let's go ahead and close that poll. And we'll get started with the discussion. So we're here talking about compliance and security. I think most of us probably know they're not terms that should be used interchangeably, I hope, at this point. But maybe, we could dig a little deeper into exactly where we're going to start. So let's look at the compliance piece first. Joe, do you want to speak to What is compliance in this context where we're talking to healthcare organizations?
Of course, Mike. Thank you. Yeah, so compliance for healthcare organizations, especially in the context of today's conversation, we're largely looking at HIPAA as the legislation that drove the security rule, which puts all the regulation in place that we'll talk through. So compliance with the security rule is a driver of a lot of the activities that the federal government expects us to be doing, right? So when we get into security, which is current and best practice and everything that Alex was just describing, it's a changing landscape. And look at that in contrast to compliance, where compliance is the security rule came out in 2003, right? They've done a really artful job of making that vague, which sometimes is very frustrating, but it helps it still apply today, even though so much has changed in our world. So compliance is where we're looking at activities that need to be completed and policies that need to be in place. And we just have to look through the lens of what's really relevant today. How do we take this obligation we have regulatory wise and put it into place in a way that actually helps us protect our organizations today?
Love it. Let's check in on our poll results here, and then we'll look at the other side of the equation. Oh, got my window leaking in there to the background. What best describes you? So it looks like we've got a lot of MSPs and we have a lot of compliance officers on the line. A couple IT professionals or actual providers. So it looks like we're going to be focusing on the business case for the MSPs and compliance officers. That'll be a really good split where we're talking about the compliance concerns. Alex, on the security side, setting aside the compliance part of it, like what's the security aspect here?
So kind of the way that I see the difference between compliance and security, right? Compliance is kind of a foundational framework to kind of give you the bare minimum for what you need to do. It's policies, it's regulations, it's guidance. Just because you even do all of the things that are in the compliance requirements don't necessarily mean that you're safe. And they're also typically very specific, and they're specific to the types of data that you're looking at, as opposed to a broad solution. So if I look at, for example, my wife is a physical therapist, if she's looking at the HIPAA compliance for her manual records, it's different from the compliance for her computer records. It's different from the insurance. It's different from the different things that you do to make sure that you're meeting the bare standard to get through. If you're providing security, that's an exercise. That's an ongoing thing. Joe mentioned earlier, a lot of people look at compliance as this one-time thing. We're getting a lot better with there being the concept of a compliance officer now, somebody to kind of keep track of these things as they go on to make sure, as you're dealing with GDPR requirements or HIPAA requirements, kind of like we're talking about here today, there's constantly somebody looking, but security is an exercise to make sure that somebody can't get in. So compliance kind of tells you what to do, but security tells you it's a measurement metric. We're successful or we're not, in kind of a binary state. So if something is secure, they don't get in, ideally. I think we've learned over the years that there's no perfect solution. If you're connected to the internet, there is a way in, but security is making sure that you're doing all of those things all the time, monitoring and engaging on those ongoing exercises to make sure that you're doing everything that you physically can to make sure that you're successful. And I'd say that's the difference.
Rebecca, I think you've got some experience in healthcare. So if we look at compliance as kind of the checklist, but security as the point of the checklist, how do you see this play out in healthcare specifically? And are you aware of any unique challenges?
Yeah, so I think there are some big unique challenges specific to healthcare. So if you think about a healthcare system, whether it be a provider or an MSP serving healthcare or a hospital or an insurance company, they are different than a lot of other organizations that kind of work within these types of compliance, like for instance, finance. So in finance, everyone is finance focused, everyone's probably pretty tech savvy. But if you think about a hospital and the people who have access to the PHI, that's what you want to protect with HIPAA, it's not just the tech savvy people that have access to the data. You have people that run the gamut of super high tech. So like IT people, or maybe an MRI tech, all the way to people who barely ever have to use a computer except to access those patient records. And those people might not have the same understanding of what goes into cybersecurity, or how risks can happen, or what can go wrong. Like if I click on a phishing link in my email, what's the worst that could happen? They might not have any idea of what a can of worms they're opening up. So for healthcare, it's much more important to educate people in a way that makes sense to them, and tell them explicitly, like, this is why we have these things in place. This is why we need you not to try to bypass these security and compliance tools that we have in place. And this is what can happen if it does go wrong, right? Because with that whole like gamut of different tech levels, there are some people that really just have no exposure ever before, and they don't know that what they're doing can be such an issue.
And in fact, you came with receipts to this conversation.
I did.
And what we see here, phishing and deception, that could maybe even be particularly targeted at the less tech savvy people, the admins, the people at the front desk, the people who are handling patient records. 7% of these threats. Rebecca, do you just want to give an overview of how you got these stats, and then we could maybe dig in a little bit more specifically with Alex?
Yeah, sure. So at DNSFilter, we filter out security type risks, and then we also classify different types of websites. So I just pulled down for a couple of our healthcare clients what types of security threats their people who have their computers are clicking on. So it doesn't speak to whether or not we block them, whether or not they have them blocked on their site. It's just, did anyone click on these types of things? And what you can see here is that I think it's 89% of the bad clicks, that I'll call them, were proxy and filtering avoidance, which basically means people are searching for or trying to circumvent things like DNSFilter or a VPN, or the exact things that are supposed to be upholding the security of the company. So 90% of the bad clicks that we see are people trying to get around the system.
Alex,
and then beyond that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. Didn't mean to interrupt. Anything you'd add more specifically on these threats, Alex?
Yeah, I'd actually kind of like to highlight what this means in the viewpoint of compliance, right? This is a specific set of data targeted around a specific situation problem. DNSFilter serves a specific purpose. So if we were doing something with compliance for what we're doing, this data looks very, very skewed, because we're looking at, this huge swath of people trying to get around what we're looking at, and the security and compliance things for aligning with what we're looking at look very different than someone who's doing, say, for example, endpoint detection and response, where they're seeing different things in malware, where they're seeing different threats in ransomware, where they're seeing different aspects of, if you were looking at a different part of the tech stack, because we are a technology company, we're trying to do this through tech. If you were looking at the compliance, the security aspect and the compliance checklist would look completely different, even though security is really security no matter where you are.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to put that through that filter.
Sure. So Joe, you saw that list of threats. Presumably those are the things the checklists are meant to stop, right? What does it look like getting to that point for these healthcare organizations?
Yeah, good point, Mike. And because we have to look at these current threats just as we're doing right now in this presentation, because the spirit of the risk analysis that we're required to do is that we're looking at current threats, right? And each year, as a healthcare entity, to do a successful security risk analysis, you need to understand where the threats are this year, right? It's an evolving activity, like was mentioned earlier. Compliance is a journey, and so is security. So understanding what's happening right now is really important. Phishing and malware, some of the areas highlighted there. So phishing has become this area that we're seeing so many ransomware. The vast majority of ransomware attacks originating with phishing and leading to data exfiltration and data encryption. And so we watch that and say this year, one of the things we need to be doing is security awareness for our employees, right? For our staff. And as Rebecca mentioned, our staff, that's not what they were trained in. That's not their natural bent to be thinking defensively and thinking about their role in protecting this data. So security awareness, as well as then investing in the tools that they're going to click those links anyway, no matter how much we work with them on. So what's the next step to protect them when they do fall for a phishing email? And that's what should be on everybody's minds right now.
Yeah, I'm sure any tech on the call today understands that. So if we,
Can I follow up on that a little bit, Mike?
Sure, Alex.
I kind of wanted to highlight the point also that one of the things, particularly dealing with the non-technical component of healthcare in particular, one of the things you're not going to see on our spreadsheet or our numbers or our pie charts is social engineering. That's not a technology solution. That's a people solution. And if these people aren't used to having to think about the technical components that go along with manipulating the human factor to get to the computer factor, that's something that we can't really do through security compliance, but it's something that we can do through training compliance. And those are, again, different aspects of the same problem that kind of makes that distinction between security and compliance the way that we're talking about today.
Yeah, because presumably the purpose of the regulations that you are complying with is to make your network more secure. But there are always ways around that, right? So what's the balance there, Rebecca?
I think it's hard. I think an important aspect of this type of security and compliance is educating people at the level that they're comfortable with and in a way that makes sense to them, but then also testing it. So we gave you a training on phishing emails. We told you all of the different things that phishing emails would say. Now we're going to send you phishing emails in a couple different ways and see if you click on them. And if you do click on them, we're going to use that. We're going to take that information, go back and change our training to kind of modify it to work better in that situation, because we know that people click the button anyways. I mean, I've worked at tech companies where people still will test them with phishing emails, or at one company, we actually had someone buy the gift cards. And we were a tech firm, and it's just sometimes people panic because the social engineering aspect that Alex was talking about, they say it's an email from the CEO. It's always urgent. It's, can you do this right now? Hurry up and do it before you check and make sure that this email is actually from our company or that I'm actually the CEO. And that's how they get people.
So you go through this exercise with a lot of people, Joe. What is I guess, how strong a correlation is there between compliance and security? Are companies that go through this exercise, healthcare organizations who do this, are they more secure? And then what do they need to do even beyond that?
So it's evolving quickly and in a good way, I think, as everyone's awareness of what these current threats are, what the threats are that are being posed to healthcare right now, and the cost of breaches, right? It's disproportionate for healthcare. How financially impactful it is when we have a breach. It's more expensive than any other industry. And, in ransomware attacks, we're more likely to pay the ransom than anywhere else because we've got possibly lives at stake. So as we look at that, we look at the threat landscape, the security risk analysis that's been required for 20 years under HIPAA is actually being looked at more and more as a strategic function to say, where are we today? What are our risks and how do we invest in protecting us versus did we check the box? Did we fill out a spreadsheet? Did we capture the data points that we need to? So one of the biggest ways it's evolving is we are seeing a receptivity to use that activity to truly actually strategically plan to protect your organization. We don't want breaches done. So we're seeing collaboration between the compliance officers and the CISOs or the CIOs in the health system that we haven't necessarily seen before. And then to the compliance officers on this call, I would challenge you, if your IT department does this and they're saying, yes, it's done, have you looked at that scope of that SRA? Does it match what your understanding of a comprehensive SRA is? And in so many situations, current penalties or new customers for us, we see where that it was really just a basic spreadsheet. It wasn't actually looking at all the functions that you as a compliance officer want to make sure are done to really understand that you've looked at your risks exhaustively and to hold up in an audit, right?
Yeah, and based on that, let's take a look at another poll for our compliance officers, for our providers, for our IT staff. Which of these is your top priority? Is it system stability, user management, compliance, preventing these data breaches, or just something else? And you can go ahead and put that in the chat box if you've got something else. While we're here, I'll also share Joe's comment. That in healthcare, I think the best way is to make it a patient safety issue. The cyber industry is starting to see that, and it helps put the problems and risks in user understandable terms. Rebecca, what do you think of this approach?
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. So there is a hospital, actually a small hospital in the town that I work in, and they had an attack last year that left them without computers for a month and a half, a ransomware attack. And if you really think about that, so my neighbor is an ER doctor, and he was telling me about how they were postponing surgeries that were elective at the time for up to 2 to 3 months just because of this backlog. And you don't want to do an elective surgery when all of the computers are down, because it just causes different issues. And some of the tech that they use to actually do the surgery is on the computers. And by the time that they get back to doing those, once I think they paid the ransom, once they get there, they're no longer optional surgeries. Now it's become emergent. And if you really think about it, because they had that breach, somebody had to live for 2 months with an issue that was once not an emergency surgery, but now is. And really that clarifies things for people. Like, we are causing harm to patients by not having proper security in place.
Yeah, and if we look at the results, it does tend to be more on the technical side, maybe, right? So to say almost all the answers had to do with compliance or preventing data breaches, a couple user management or other items, but about 2 to 1 preventing data breaches to compliance, and that accounts for most of the votes. So a lot of compliance officers here are concerned about that. A lot of IT providers here are concerned about those things. When you're having conversations, Joe, with Medcurity prospects, Medcurity clients and users, what's the focus? Is it on the security side? Is it on the compliance side? Is it something else, a hybrid? How do you have these conversations?
Great question, Mike. We've made it very intentional for us to basically take the compliance activity, the requirement, the security risk analysis, the risk management that follows that, take that required activity and use it to actually assess security. So we're taking those compliance items. We've got that gap analysis that will guide anyone through. Here's the policies you should have. Here's the activities we're required to complete. But we've tied that to best practices that match the current threat landscape. And in cases like there's a public-facing breach report on the Office of Civil Rights website, where you can see every breach of more than 500 patients. And it's really sobering that the activity on that has picked up so much in the last couple of years. We've gone from a couple events a week to multiple events a day. And when you look at that and actually graph that out, you'll see that the cybersecurity type events have just taken over. Whereas it was, there's snooping, of course, employee snooping, there's you lost devices, that kind of thing. Those are still about the same volume. But the reason there's been this huge uptick is now almost 80% of the breaches are happening because of cybersecurity attacks. So we look at that, and when you do a risk analysis, you're looking through that lens and saying, well, I know where our risks are. Maybe geographically we have some natural disaster risks, but almost for everyone, a cybersecurity attack has become the major risk to be looking at and saying, where do we need to invest? What do we need to do right now? So it's using compliance and the activities we have to do anyway to put us in a position where we're actually looking at real-time current events and threats.
And to stick with you for a minute here, what are some misconceptions that you run into as you're having these conversations with people around compliance and security? Anything come up as you're always trying to convince people, trying to get on the same page?
One of the areas that we see customers bring us in. We have customers come to us once they've had a breach and they're in an investigation with the federal government, right? So then they reach out to us because they provide whatever they thought was their security program to the Office of Civil Rights, and the OCR says, this is not a comprehensive security risk analysis, and you had a few policies, but they were generic and you weren't implementing them, and you didn't make investments to close the gaps, the risks that you identified, you did nothing to mitigate them, right? And so that's where we see that there's maybe a misconception that they've done a spreadsheet. They've done the checkbox activities, and therefore they're in a good place. They've probably done the same thing for 10 years in a row, and nobody asked, right? So they just feel like it's fine until they're actually in an investigation and they have to look up definitions and actually present something that holds up. So understanding what a true security risk analysis is. Sometimes there's deference to, or they defer to the EHR vendor, thinking that that's completed it, so they say, well, my EHR is compliant, so we're good, right? And as we've been talking about today, there's so much more to that. Protected health information is in more places. The threats are much bigger than just where your patient data lies. So I think understanding those threats is so important right now.
Yeah, so much bigger than one vendor, bigger even than this more comprehensive checklist to cover all the bases. You'd be stretched pretty thin potentially. So Rebecca, looking at healthcare specifically again, how would you, so like, it's easy to feel like, oh, there's so many regulations, there are so many things I have to do, there are so many boxes I have to check. What's the value of having this kind of regulation to work towards in the healthcare industry, do you think?
Well, I mean, the value is, there are multiple values. So I think the first thing that comes to mind for me, coming from a healthcare background, is the value to the patient. So we have what I talked about before, where ransomware attacks stop hospitals from working or stop providers from working for a certain amount of time, and then people defer healthcare. But another piece of that is just the release of PHI. So if you have some sort of breach where data gets out there, imagine, so the last health system I worked at, we were providers for a sports team. And that the data for that sport team was very highly secure. If we would leak that and everybody knew who tore their ACL and how it was fixed, like, those are problems that people most of the time probably don't even think about, but that's very personal information for someone that other people can use for their own, like, monetary gain, right? It's not, I think it's hard to not, it's hard for us as security specialists to think of these issues in terms of individual people, but I also think that that's where security is the most important, especially in healthcare.
Yeah, so if we look at compliance, maybe to Alex, say we've got one of these IT providers who's saying my networks are locked down. We've got a compliance officer who's saying I'm up to date. I've got my documentation. I've got my user training. We've got everything covered. What's most likely to still be the gap?
I would say it's probably the human element. I don't know that I've seen really many of any healthcare providers that are highly plugged into SOX. Some of them, farm out some of that responsibility, but there's not enough manpower or enough cycles or enough money being spent on having the systems, monitoring the systems, measuring the systems, and making sure that you actually have the visibility to pick up the kind of threats that are being applied to these systems to be able to mitigate them properly. I would actually say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that's my biggest concern.
And you had mentioned social engineering attacks. We looked at the graph that showed phishing attacks as a big chunk of the pie. What's the, one of the questions that came in is what's the goal of these attacks? What are they trying to accomplish? Like, if you've got a checklist, you need email filtering, you need training, this is a threat. Like, what's the reality of this threat, though?
There are a number of different things that they could be trying to leverage. They could be trying to set up reverse access into the network. They could be trying to get personal information so that they could sell it. I think we've all heard at this point, people like to reuse account names and passwords. If they can get any of that information from a lower hanging fruit, they can leverage that somewhere else. There's a tremendous market on the dark web about selling PHI and PII. They bundle these in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records, and they sell them for $1.25 a piece just to make money. There's a monetary aspect of it, just to sell that personal account for people to do whatever they want. And they kind of roll all that information back in together. So they use it. There's kind of the broad spectrum of all of these threats, from something as simple as, so I clicked a link to a bad website. They could be installing malware. They could be analyzing the network. They could be trying to do an additional probe to get in to do a data breach. It's really the full spectrum. It's for something as simple as I just clicked a link. It could result in just about anything.
Yeah. So Joe, how much do you get into the actual, hearing these security horror stories? How does this come up with your businesses that you're working with?
We are often brought in after an event like this, and we're not the first call. We shouldn't be the first call if your data is encrypted, but it's when you start looking back at the rest of the picture and saying, okay, now we need to make sure that we as a health system, that we're not being negligent, and that we can demonstrate that we're doing everything we could do, right? There's almost a resignation to the fact at this point that a breach is going to happen some way or another. I mean, statistically, everybody's running into this, right? So being prepared to be able to present and show we were doing everything we could to mitigate the risk is a conversation we have, and why people come to us. So when we're coming in at the tail end of these events, or when we're brought in even during them, it's absolutely warfare, as a lot of what Alex was just describing. I mean, this is you've got the IT staff running on fumes because they've been going for weeks straight and going home to sleep for 5 hours, right? And you have the reputational impact that's happening right now around the community, watching you as you're not able to provide services, and you have to do a press release, or there's a requirement. Breaches of over 500 patients, you have to tell the media, and it really we really have gotten to see how these play out, the negotiation that happens with the bad actors to reduce that ransomware payment before they pay it, and the cybersecurity insurance company involvement, all those pieces of it. It's an exhausting incident, and that group each time becomes a huge advocate of both the compliance activities, being ready for this, and one thing we haven't really got into, but having a security incident plan, so they know what they're going to do when something like this occurs, who's involved, what are our first steps, what are our first calls. All of that is probably the biggest difference maker in those early days of a big security incident happening, and how well you respond to it.
Absolutely. And I'll just remind everybody, we are live here. So if you're on the webinar, please start entering some more questions, and you've got some great people here on the line to answer them for you. So take advantage of the opportunity, whether you're here
I
as
have a question. Maybe we can get some discussion started from trust people, I guess. And I think this is probably more for Joe, and Joe just mentioned it, but Rebecca, if you have any input in it as well. There's been a lot going on in the cyber insurance realm lately. There's been a lot more payouts. There's been repeat offenders, with the bad actors coming back and attacking the same people because they know they're going to get payouts. Prices are going up for the insurance. Ransomware is starting to be rejected by some of the companies as something that they don't cover anymore, just because it's too much of a risk. Do you guys have any real opinions on the role of cyber insurance and kind of where that fits into this compliance and security piece, and the value of it, maybe?
Yeah, projecting ahead the next few months feels like projecting ahead on the market, trying to guess, broadly what's going to happen and have a crystal ball on it. But what's happened so far is those premium rates have just gone through the roof, right? I mean, some of our customers have seen a 8x to 10x increase in the cost of their cybersecurity insurance premium in the past 6 or 7 years. So it's because of the payouts, because of the expense of what's happening right now. In some ways, that's becoming even, for some groups, untenable. We recommend cybersecurity insurance. I mean, hands down, we don't think you want to fly without it, because in those events, those are really the groups that can be the most helpful. And it's just it's very destructive, and it puts some groups out of business if they didn't have some kind of insurance policy protecting them. So we recommend cybersecurity insurance. We know it's getting really expensive, and they're starting to push more requirements. So they'll insure you if you have multi-factor authentication set up, if you can present your security incident plan, right? So they're starting to become another driver of some of these activities that will hopefully help protect organizations, but they're holding them to a higher standard now before they'll insure them for sure.
Anything to add, Rebecca?
No, I mean, I can say from my experience, I know that the companies I've worked at have definitely 8 to 10 times the cyber security insurance has increased. And you're right, it is going to get to the point where people are not going to be able to afford it. I don't know if it's going to stabilize it all, or if it's going to be like auto insurance when they first started making cars. Like, are we going to figure things out and then it'll come back down, or is it just going to keep going and there's going to be no resolution there? It's going to go away is what's going to happen.
We did, DNSFilter did a joint webinar with a couple companies maybe last month, maybe 6 weeks ago. I think it was Blumera, maybe Fifth Gear, and Clear Guidance Partners. So I have messaged somebody to try and get a link to that webinar. If you're somebody on the call here today, you may also be interested in these insurance questions. So we'll try to get a link out to that past webinar where we dug really deep on the insurance side of it. We did get a question from Janet here in the chat. Let me bring it up. How do you mitigate actual patient theft and correct an issue? It's been reported to the HHS as patient theft. So how do you, if you experience patient theft, how do you mitigate and correct that? Let's go with Joe.
Sure. So it depends on the situation, right? There's a lot of unique, based on the type of event that occurred, a lot of unique factors. But broadly, a couple things to keep in mind is you want to do a HIPAA risk or a HIPAA breach assessment. So if you haven't already deemed it as a data breach, there's the risk assessment. Medcurity users, there's one on the portal that they can go grab. There's other tools out there you can get, but you want to walk through and document and keep your documentation of why you're considering it a breach or not a breach, right? So I want to start with that because I want to be really cautious there. We do have entities that have decided not to call things a breach, a data breach. It was a security incident, but we don't think anything was exfiltrated or taken, and that's come back in bigger penalties and greater issues to not just report it in the first place. So I'm glad to hear that it was already reported as it should be. But then from there, I mean, we have some compliance requirements: notification to all the patients, notification to Health and Human Services. If it's over 500 patients, it's a much bigger, you've got to do the media route of this as well. And then I guess, Janet, feel free to reach out to us if there's more tactical things based on the kind of event. I'm happy to share anything with you on what we do from a technical standpoint to mitigate if they're in your network, what we do from, the identity loss, anything like that. So we can go deeper into specifics, but the rest of it's pretty varied based on the kind of event that happened.
So let's expand on that a little bit with Alex, maybe. So say you've had a breach, you start taking action to report it, to remediate. Like, how do you know you're good again?
Well, obviously you thought you were good in the first place. So the real answer to that is you don't. I think that's probably one of those things, and it becomes very important at that point to reassess your security response plan, right? Because that horse has already left the stable. To kind of look at it from the other side of the table for a while, I reported breaches as a third party. We'd go out on the dark web, we would pull these breaches in, and if we found a particular organization that had a large representation in some of these breaches, or if it was their entire database, typically we would just report it to them unless there was some regulatory reason we had to report it to somebody else. Obviously, we'd always tell the company because they need to know that their data is out on the dark web. But sometimes there's government officials that are involved, or there's some compliance regulation that somebody else in the government or whatever government for that country is involved needs to be notified, or we have to notify law enforcement. But for the most part, that didn't happen. I don't know that as the regulatory guidance continues to evolve, that's going to continue to be the case. I'm starting to think that the companies should start to be more comfortable self-reporting, because a lot of these breach notifications are coming from third-party agencies, and they might be telling somebody else. And if you don't self-report, obviously the consequences of that are going to be much higher. And if you are in some kind of dispute, like Joe was mentioning earlier, where sometimes you determine that it's not a breach and you're publicly outed as being wrong about that, the reputational impact of that is going to be significantly higher as well. So I think we probably, as security people and as compliance people, we need to be more mindful of keeping that information involved in the possible consequences that go beyond where we have the risk model set up right now.
Absolutely. So to Jessica, who asked about the cybersecurity insurance presentation, I think we did find a link for that, and that was put into the Q&A. So anybody who's interested in that should be able to find that link in the question section. I think I'm going to get, yeah, Corey actually just posted it also to the general chat. So if you're on the webinar today, have questions about the insurance side of it, I definitely recommend checking that out. Question from Jessica. Has anyone ever had the FBI come back and share with the organization after a reported ransomware attack, whereby the FBI notifies the organization that it is currently monitoring the sale of data on the black market? My suspicion is that that might actually be outside the scope of what the FBI is going to do on that. Do you have any experience with this, Joe?
We have, I mean, this is going to be like one-off examples, right? I no idea on trends, but there was an entity recently that was notified by the FBI that they had a security issue and potential breach, and then they had an incident happen, and because they had done nothing to mitigate what the feds told them to do, the OCR was way more heavy-handed in that financial penalty afterwards. So our takeaways there are that, you know, in that case, I think the FBI was the lead agency, but they did proactively reach out to a healthcare organization and say, we see these vulnerabilities, you need to check into this. And the only reason that became visible is because they didn't take care of it, and it became a well-publicized incident and penalty. So I don't know how often they're doing this, that health systems actually do respond and take action. But I haven't heard it in our customer base across the country. I haven't heard people bring up that they've been proactively alerted by the feds. I mean, we're always encouraging them to go to dark web scans, something Alex mentioned earlier. I mean, you can go see if your data, especially your credentials data is available with a scan, and a lot of groups do that at a low cost. Or maybe the MSPs on the phone maybe have tools to do that. But we highly encourage that you're always watching and proactively monitoring yourself as well.
Absolutely. Janet asked about joining the call late. Is the recording going to be available? Absolutely. I'm sure an email will come out following the presentation. We're recording it. A bunch of different places. You'll absolutely be able to get access to it following the recording. To the panelists, we have talked about probably a couple different parts of the life cycle, right? Getting started with implementation. You've got you're going through the exercise, you're established, you've done it, but then are getting breached anyway on the back end. Rebecca, I imagine a lot of the people on the call today have already started, but where would you start trying to address compliance and security if you're a healthcare organization?
Oh, well, you would start with HIPAA. That's the easy answer. That's like, there are definitely guidelines out there. Like Joe said, they're a little vague. So from there, I think one of the first things you want to do is kind of what we talked about a little bit before. So follow all of the HIPAA compliance guidelines. Maybe reach out to a company like Joe's before you have an issue. Could be smart. And then I think another important thing, which we also already talked about, was developing that incident response plan. And I think that's even required by HIPAA, but it's just like a step-by-step what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, who's going to do it. And I think another big thing to keep in mind is, like, because for healthcare providers, sometimes a provider is a single person. And they have to follow all these rules, and they don't have a team, and they don't have a compliance officer, and they don't have all of these different steps that like a health plan necessarily would have. And I think an important thing for someone like that to remember is don't panic. There are resources out there. If you haven't had a breach yet, if you think you've had a breach, if you're not even sure how to tell if you've had a breach yet or not, like there are people out there to help. There's tech and tools and resources for you out there, and just like reach out to me, reach out to Alex, reach out to Mike, reach out to Joe. Like we will help you.
Excellent. Another question came in. This is starting to feel a little specific, so probably it's time to just contact Joe at this point. But do we have to re-report to patients if we have already reported to them when it happened?
I'll just give a quick answer. I mean, if that letter, that notification that happened in the first place, check the boxes, because we've got 3 or 4 things we need to communicate when a breach happens. So if you had an exhaustive letter that went out that said, here's what we're doing as mitigation, here's what happened, here's what we think, what was exposed or not exposed, and here's an offer for identity protection for, whatever period of time. So if you've checked those compliance boxes in your initial communication, top of mind, I'm not aware of any requirement you're going to need to reach back out. Like that's typically 1 round of letters, and then patients, some patients are going to follow up and ask you questions, of course. But I'm not aware of a specific instance that's going to push you to go do additional communication if you communicated all those initial pieces of information.
Excellent, thank you. So looking back at this timeline, right? What's the biggest hole that people who have gone through the compliance exercise, who have their documentation, what's the biggest hole they most likely still have? If they missed something, what are they most likely to have missed?
So I'll share one thing that comes up a lot. So there's two parts of that question. Things are changing fast, right? So it's not that they missed it. It may just be something that you didn't need to worry about as much before. We didn't talk about MFA being hands down basically a requirement 5 years ago, right? But it was on the horizon, and we talked about it. Now it's this, really don't want remote access without MFA as an example. But what's missed when you already put a compliance program in place is often the execution. So we see really solid policies sometimes that have been developed. Back in 2018, there was this great push, and we developed every policy we're supposed to have, and we've written up every step. And then what we find as we step in for these annual SRAs is maybe that audit that was well-intended, that you're going to look at who's viewing whose patient charts and just make sure there's no snooping. You wrote in your policy you're going to do it every 3 months, right? But there's no evidence it's been done for a year and a half, right? Having the evidence of a backup test. So are you testing and make sure you can actually back up and restore your protected health information? It's usually in the policy. Yes, we're going to do it. But then when we come in and do this check-in with our customers, it's been a couple years. They just haven't got to it. So the quick answer there is maybe some type of calendar is needed, right? A shared calendar that your risk management, the people who are involved in that are watching and holding each other accountable to say, okay, remember in April, we do employee training and a backup test, and here's how we document it. Give me the evidence as soon as it's done. And make sure that those parts of the policy that require proactive work are being followed. Because it's been set it and forget it for some organizations, and we try to help them bring it into real life without it becoming some kind of huge burden for them.
Yeah, and there's a lot to it. We have, I'm sure, MSPs that specialize in healthcare and HIPAA compliance. We have compliance officers who are on the line that I'm sure spend their entire day buried in this. We probably also, though, have some MSPs who have a couple healthcare clients and maybe aren't full-time devoted to this. We might have some compliance officers who this is a second or third responsibility for them. What's the best way for people in that situation to kind of stay on top of things as best they can? Anyone want to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, that's something that we take really serious. So we do just straight educational webinars, and we do a newsletter each week that's got hot topics of what's happening right now. Everything that we try to do to communicate out to support our customers, because they don't have time to go search for security awareness tidbits to share with their employees, right? If it's not their full-time job. So I think that's how we do it. But I think partnering with companies that provide you that ongoing education in any way, and just kind of drip feed it to you is extremely valuable and helps helps distill this down to just what's practical for you, instead of you going and reading the new 2,000-page clarification document on the privacy rule that's coming out, right? Just we want to, groups like us, we want to help simplify this and just give you what you need to know to do the steps that are important right now.
Excellent. As we wrap up here,
before that, I was just going to say, especially with groups that are smaller, and especially if, their compliance officer, it's their third additional duty, right? A lot of these healthcare systems, a lot of these programs are strapped for cash. They can't afford to hire an entire security team. That's why we outsource a lot of them. The compliance side is typically going to be covered, right? They're going to go through these checklists because they want to maintain their licenses. They want to maintain their business. But the security side, if you can't afford to hire an entire security team, once or twice a year, hire a red team to come in and do an actual test to see where your vulnerabilities are and fix them. It's still going to be expensive, but it's going to be a lot cheaper in the long run than having to deal with some of these breaches or some of the other possibilities that you have to be confronted with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rebecca, any final thoughts as we start to wind down here?
No, I mean, I think we had some great information here, and I think we did a good job of spanning the different audiences that we have within this group. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. We're all more than willing to help, and I think we're all on LinkedIn. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So let's wrap this up. Joe, tell us a little bit about Medcurity specifically. I think you've got an offer for us. What do you want to add here?
Yeah. Just briefly, we talked a bit about it, but we are a platform that guides you first and foremost through the security risk analysis. And we bring in everything's cross-mapped to NIST for those that want that, need that, but we bring in just a lot of clarity to what that process should look like and help you assess it. And we do services on top of that. So organizations that want that third-party perspective, we're on site all around the country helping walk through that security risk analysis and then using the platform to manage it through the rest of the year. So your action items are there and you can assign them to your partners, your vendors, your employees as needed. So we have a 7-day trial. If you want to get in and just play with the platform, we're certainly happy to talk to you, answer any questions anytime on the topic. So we're just joining the community if you're comfortable where you are right now and just want to get on the newsletter, and we appreciate anybody that's a part of our community. So thanks.
Yep. And to be able to take advantage of that 7-day free offer, you can visit medcurity.com/demo or email Rachel M at medcurity.com directly to get more information and get started with that. On the DNSFilter side, you've heard Alex talk about some of what we do on the security side to help protect our customers. The graph that we showed early on are threats that we block and protect healthcare organizations and all of our customers from on an ongoing basis. We are constantly scanning for new threats, adding them to our threat database, and helping customers manage those threats based on Alex's awesome research that he's doing over there in Rebecca's department. And our offer is a 14-day free trial of DNSFilter. Super easy to set up. If you ever configured if you've ever configured DNS on a network, it's as easy as that. Can be very straightforward. 14-day full feature, unrestricted trial. Sign up for 14 days at app.dnsfilter.com/signup, or you can check out our website and get demos or check out pricing, whatever you want there. Great panel today, everyone who joined. Thank you to Joe from Medcurity. Thank you, Rebecca and Alex from DNSFilter. I hope we get the chance to do this again sometime. Thanks to everybody who joined us on GoToWebinar. And if you're watching this recording, enjoy. We'll see you on our next webinar. And we're just going to keep doing this, bringing great resources for providers, for MSPs, for IT people. Check it out. Thanks for joining today. We'll see you on the next webinar.